The night was quiet in the small town of Riverside when everything changed forever, and Jake Harrison walked into the corner store just wanting to buy some milk and bread for his apartment because he had an early class the next morning at the community college where he studied education and worked part-time at the youth center, teaching kids how to read. And his mom had always told him to help others, and that's exactly what he planned to do with his life. And the store was almost empty, except for the old lady, Mrs. Campbell behind the counter, who smiled at him like she always did, because Jake came here 3 times a week and was always polite and always asked about her grandchildren, and tonight was no different as he grabbed the items he needed and walked toward the counter, pulling out his phone to check if his roommate Chris had sent him the grocery list, and the phone's screen glowed in his hand as he approached the register. And Mrs. Campbell started scanning his items when suddenly the front door exploded inward with a crash of breaking glass, and Jake turned toward the noise, confused and scared, and saw 2 police officers with guns pointed directly at him, and he froze completely, unsure what was happening or what to do, and his phone was still in his hand, raised slightly because he had been looking at it, and everything happened so fast that his brain couldn't process the danger. And Officer Danny Martinez didn't say a word, didn't shout freeze or put your hands up or identify himself as police, and instead just started firing his weapon. And Officer Kyle Brooks did the same, and the bullets tore through the air, and Jake felt something slam into his chest like being hit by a truck, and then another impact in his shoulder, and he was falling backward, and his phone went flying from his hand and clattered across the floor, and Mrs. Campbell was screaming, and Jake hit the ground hard and couldn't breathe, and there was pain everywhere, and his vision was getting dark around the edges, and he could hear boots crunching on broken glass coming closer, and voices shouting. But they sounded far away, like he was underwater, and he tried to move his hand, tried to show them he wasn't a threat, wasn't armed, wasn't dangerous. But his body wouldn't respond, and the ceiling lights above him were so bright. They hurt his eyes, and he thought about his dad, Commander Richard Harrison, who he hadn't seen in 6 months because his dad was always deployed somewhere, doing something classified and dangerous. And Jake had chosen a different path, had chosen teaching over military service, had chosen to build instead of fight, and now he was lying on a dirty store floor bleeding and dying, and he didn't understand why. And Officer Martinez was radioing for an ambulance, his voice shaking, and Officer Brooks was standing over Jake looking down at him, and Jake could see the fear in the officer's eyes and wanted to tell him it was okay. Wanted to say he forgave him, but he couldn't speak, couldn't make his mouth work, and Mrs. Campbell was crying and saying there was no robbery, no crime, just a boy buying groceries. And the officers were looking at each other, and Jake could see the moment they realized their mistake, could see the horror dawning on their faces, and blood was pooling beneath him, warm and sticky, and he was so cold, suddenly shivering despite the summer heat, and his phone was on the floor 3 feet away, screen cracked but still glowing with the grocery list still visible, and milk was one of the items and bread was another, and such simple things, such normal everyday things. And now he might die before ever drinking that milk or eating that bread. And sirens were wailing in the distance, getting closer, and Jake tried to focus on the sound, tried to stay conscious, tried to hold on, but it was so hard, and he was so tired, and his dad's face flashed through his mind, strong and serious and proud. And Jake wondered if his dad would be proud of him, or disappointed that he hadn't fought, back hadn't survived like a Harrison should, and then paramedics were there cutting away his shirt, pressing things against his chest, and the pain flared white hot, and he gasped, and someone said, "He's still with us." And they lifted him onto a stretcher, and the fluorescent lights of the store gave way to the dark sky filled with stars, and then the inside of an ambulance, and a paramedic was talking to him, telling him to stay awake, telling him to focus on her voice, and her name was Amy. And she had kind eyes, and she kept saying, "You're going to be okay." And Jake wanted to believe her, but the darkness was so heavy and so complete, and he let it take him, and the last thing he remembered was Amy's voice saying, "We're losing him," and then nothing at all. And 300 miles away, Commander Richard Harrison was sitting in a briefing room at the naval base going over mission plans with his team, when his phone buzzed, and he almost didn't answer because he was in the middle of something important. But something made him look at the screen, made him pick it up, and the voice on the other end said, "Commander Harrison, this is Lieutenant Sophie Grant from Riverside Police Department, and there's been an incident involving your son," and the words that followed made the decorated Navy SEAL who had faced enemy fire in 12 countries and had survived things that would break most men feel his world collapse around him, And he was on his feet and moving before Lieutenant Grant even finished speaking, and his team commander, Captain Frank Meyer, took one look at his face and said, "Go." And Richard was running toward the airfield where a helicopter was being prepped, because when a SEAL commander's son is shot, the Navy moves heaven and earth. And during the flight, Richard sat in silence, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight, and all he could think about was his boy, his only child, the kid who wanted to teach and help others, and had never hurt anyone in his entire life. The helicopter cut through the night sky, and Richard Harrison stared out at the darkness below, watching the lights of small towns pass beneath them like scattered stars, and every minute felt like an hour, and every mile felt like 1,000, and he kept replaying the phone call in his head, kept hearing Lieutenant Grant's careful words, "Your son has been shot. He's in surgery. He's critical. You need to come now." And Richard had trained for every possible scenario, had prepared for combat and survival and loss, but nothing had prepared him for this, and the pilot, Captain Steve Morris, pushed the helicopter as fast as it would go and didn't ask questions, just focused on getting them there. And Richard thought about the last time he had seen Jake, which was 6 months ago when he had been home on leave, and they had gone fishing at the lake. And Jake had talked about his plans for the future, about wanting to open a community center for underprivileged kids, about making a real difference, and Richard had been so proud. Even though a small part of him had wished his son would follow him into the military, would carry on the family tradition. But Jake had his own path, and Richard respected that, loved him for it. And now that path might be cut short by a bullet from someone who was supposed to protect and serve. And the rage that burned in Richard's chest was unlike anything he had felt in combat. Because this was personal. This was his son, his blood, his legacy. And when the helicopter finally touched down at the small airport in Riverside, there was a police car waiting with lights flashing, and Detective Lisa Monroe was standing beside it, her face grave and serious, and she shook Richard's hand and said, "Commander Harrison, I'm so sorry." And Richard just nodded and got in the car, and they drove through the empty streets toward Memorial Hospital, and Detective Monroe briefed him on the way, told him about the false alarm, about the officers who responded, about the shooting that happened without warning, and Richard listened without speaking. His jaw clenched so tight it hurt. And when they arrived at the hospital, he was out of the car before it fully stopped and striding through the emergency room. Doors and nurses and doctors moved aside when they saw him. This tall man in military uniform with eyes like ice, and a nurse named Kelly Roberts led him to the intensive care unit where a surgeon was waiting, and the surgeon's scrubs were stained with blood. And Richard knew it was his son's blood, and the surgeon said, "Commander Harrison, I'm Dr. Paul Mitchell, and your son is out of surgery. But I won't lie to you, the next 72 hours are critical." And he took 3 bullets, 1 collapsed. His lung, another damaged his shoulder, and the 3rd grazed his ribs, and he lost a lot of blood, and we've done everything we can. But now it's up to him. And Richard asked, "Can I see him?" And Dr. Mitchell nodded and led him to a room where machines beeped and hissed, and there in the bed was Jake, looking so small and pale and fragile, with tubes running from his arms and a ventilator helping him breathe. And Richard walked slowly to the bedside and took his son's hand. And it was cold, so cold, and he sat down in the chair beside the bed and said, "I'm here, son, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." And the hours passed, and nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting medications, and Detective Monroe returned with her partner, Sergeant Paul Hendricks, and they showed Richard the security footage from the store. And he watched his son walk to the counter, watched him pull out his phone, watched the door explode, and the officers open fire without hesitation, without command, without any attempt at de-escalation. And Richard had operated in war zones with stricter rules of engagement, had made split-second decisions under enemy fire, and had still managed to identify threats before pulling the trigger. And these officers had none of that discipline, none of that training, and his son was paying the price. And Detective Monroe said the officers have been placed on administrative leave, and there will be a full investigation. And Richard said administrative leave, and she nodded, and he felt the anger rising again, but pushed it down because right now his son needed him. And the anger could wait. And morning came, and Jake hadn't woken up, and Dr. Mitchell said his body is fighting. And that's good. But we need to watch for infection, for complications, for any sign that things are getting worse. And Richard stayed by the bedside all day and into the next night, and friends started to arrive. Jake's roommate Chris and his girlfriend Emma and his study group. from college and his supervisor from the youth center, Mr. David Wright, and they all looked shocked and scared, and they told Richard stories about Jake, about how he helped struggling students, about how he volunteered every weekend, about how he broke up a fight between two kids by talking to them about respect and understanding, and Richard listened and realized he didn't know this version of his son, this man his boy had become, and he felt proud and heartbroken all at once. And on the second day, Professor Ellen Baker came, and she brought Jake's latest essay about building bridges in divided communities, and she read parts of it aloud and said, "Your son is special, Commander. He sees the best in people and wants to bring it out, and that's a rare gift." And Richard thanked her and sat alone with Jake again and talked to him about everything, about fishing trips and baseball games, about the time Jake was 8 and fell off his bike and didn't cry, just got back on and tried again, about how much his mother would have loved to see the man he had become, and Richard talked until his voice was hoarse and still. Jake didn't wake, and outside the hospital the news was spreading and reporters were gathering, because this wasn't just another shooting. This was a Navy SEAL commander's son, and the optics were bad, and the police department was scrambling. And Chief Norman Hughes held a press conference and said all the right words about investigations and officer safety. But they rang hollow, and Richard watched it on the small TV in Jake's room and felt disgusted. On the third day, Jake's eyes opened for just a moment, and Richard leaned forward, gripping his son's hand, and said, "Jake, can you hear me?" And Jake's eyes focused on his father's face, and there was confusion there, and pain and fear, and then his eyes closed again. But Dr. Mitchell said, "That's a good sign. That means he's fighting his way back." And Richard felt hope for the first time since the shooting. And outside the hospital, the community was rallying, and students from the college organized a vigil, and hundreds of people showed up holding candles and signs that said, "Justice for Jake," and his name is Jake Harrison, and no more violence. And the local news covered it, and then the national news picked it up, and suddenly this small town shooting was everywhere. And Richard watched the coverage and saw his son's smiling face on every channel, saw the photos from Jake's social media of him with kids at the youth center, of him volunteering at food banks, of him living the kind of life that made the world better. And the contrast with what had happened was stark and painful, and people were angry and demanding answers, and Detective Monroe came back with more information. And she sat with Richard in a private room and showed him the dash cam footage from the police cars. And Richard watched as officers Martinez and Brooks pulled up to the store, and he could hear them talking about a football game, about their weekend plans. And they weren't focused. They weren't professional. They were distracted, and then they got the call about a possible robbery. And they jumped out of the car and just started shooting. And there was no assessment, no attempt to understand the situation, no thought, just panic and poor training. And Richard had seen better discipline from fresh recruits, and he asked, "What happens now?" And Detective Monroe said honestly, "Commander, I don't know. And these cases are complicated, and officer-involved shootings rarely result in charges." And Richard said, "My son is lying in a hospital bed fighting for his life, and you're telling me these officers might walk away." And she said, "I'm telling you the system is broken, and I'm trying to fix it, but I need your help." And Richard understood what she meant, and his story, his rank, his status gave him a platform that others didn't have, and he could make noise that couldn't be ignored. And that night, a woman named Maria Santos came to see him, and she was a community organizer who had been fighting police brutality for 10 years. And she had her own story about a brother who died during a traffic stop, about a system that protected officers and ignored victims. And she said, "Commander Harrison, I know you're going through hell, but your voice matters, and people will listen to you in ways they won't listen to us." And Richard looked at this tired woman who had been fighting alone for so long, and he said, "Tell me what you need." And together they started planning. And Jake woke up again on the 4th day, and this time he stayed awake longer, and Richard was there, and he held his son's hand and said, "You're going to be okay?" And Jake tried to talk, but the ventilator prevented it. And Dr. Mitchell said, "We're going to try removing the breathing tube tomorrow if he stays stable." And that was progress, real progress, and Richard felt some of the weight lift from his chest, and he called his team and talked to Captain Meyer, who said, "Take all the time you need, and the team sends their love, and they're ready to help however they can." And Richard thanked him and returned to Jake's bedside. And that evening, Officer Martinez tried to visit the hospital, but security turned him away. And Richard heard about it, and part of him wanted to confront the man, wanted to make him see what he had done. But another part knew that wouldn't help. Jake wouldn't change anything, and the anger had to be channeled into something productive, into real change. And on the 5th day, the breathing tube came out and Jake could finally speak, and his voice was rough and painful. But he looked at his father and said Dad and Richard had to turn away for a moment because the tears came, and he couldn't stop them. And when he turned back, Jake said, "What happened?" And Richard told him everything, told him about the shooting, about the investigation, about the community response. And Jake listened, and when Richard finished, Jake said, "They shot me because of my phone." And Richard nodded, and Jake said, "I wasn't doing anything wrong," and Richard said, "I know, son, I know." And Jake was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "What are you going to do about it?" And Richard said, "Whatever it takes," and Jake nodded and said, "Good, because this can't happen to anyone else." And Richard saw the determination in his son's eyes and knew that Jake hadn't been broken. By this hadn't been destroyed, and the district attorney, Patricia Allen, requested a meeting, and Richard went to her office, and she was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had prosecuted hundreds of cases, and she said, "Commander Harrison, I'm going to be straight with you. And charging police officers is nearly impossible, and juries are sympathetic to them, and conviction rates are terrible, but this case is different, and we have video evidence and witness testimony and public pressure, and I think we can win. But I need you to be prepared for a long fight." And Richard said, "I've been fighting my whole life, and this is the most important battle I've ever faced," and she smiled grimly and said, "Then let's get to work." The charges were filed on the 7th day after the shooting, and Officer Danny Martinez and Officer Kyle Brooks were arrested and charged with attempted manslaughter and reckless endangerment, and several other counts, and the news spread like wildfire, and the police union immediately issued a statement defending the officers and talking about split-second decisions and the dangers of police work, and Richard watched the press conference and felt his blood boil because these people were defending the indefensible, were making excuses for officers who shot first and asked questions never. And Jake was sitting up in bed now, still weak, still in pain, but improving every day, and he watched the news with his father and said, "They're going to fight this, aren't they?" And Richard said, "Yes, but so are we," and the community rallied, and Maria Santos organized protests, and hundreds of people marched through the streets, demanding justice, demanding reform, and Richard joined them, walking alongside students and teachers and parents and people who had their own stories of police violence, and he listened and learned and understood that his son's case wasn't unique, wasn't isolated, but part of a larger pattern of systemic failure. And Pastor Henry Collins from the local church invited Richard to speak at a community meeting, and Richard stood before a packed room of people and talked about his son, about the kind of person Jake was, about dreams cut short by bullets that should never have been fired. And he talked about his own experience in the military, about rules of engagement, about the responsibility that comes with carrying a weapon and the discipline required to use it properly. And the room was silent as he spoke, and when he finished there was applause that lasted for minutes, and people came up to him afterward to shake his hand, to thank him, to share their own stories. And Richard realized this was bigger than just Jake, bigger than just one shooting, and it was about a system that needed to change. And he was going to be part of that change, and the preliminary hearings began 2 weeks after the shooting, and Jake was well enough to leave the hospital, though he still needed physical therapy and help with daily tasks, and Richard took him home to Jake's apartment and helped him settle in, and Jake's roommate Chris had cleaned everything and stocked the fridge and put fresh sheets on the bed, and Jake looked around his home and said, "I didn't think I'd see this place again," and Richard put his arm around his son's shoulders and said, "You're here and you're alive, and we're going to make sure what happened to you means something." And the first hearing was intense, and Richard wore his dress uniform and sat in the front row, and Jake sat beside him, still moving carefully, still healing. And officers Martinez and Brooks sat at the defense table with their lawyers, and they looked smaller, somehow diminished, and the prosecution presented the security footage and the dash cam video and the body camera footage, and the evidence was damning and undeniable, and Mrs. Campbell testified about what she saw, about the sudden violence, about Jake lying on the floor bleeding, and her testimony was powerful and emotional, and several people in the courtroom cried, and the defense tried to argue that the officers feared for their lives, that they responded to what they believed was a credible threat. But the video showed no threat, showed only a young man with a phone, and the judge, Judge Margaret Foster, was stern and serious, and she said, "This case We'll proceed to trial, and bail was set high and the officers were released pending trial. And outside the courthouse, Richard gave a statement to the press and he said, "My son is one of the lucky ones, and he survived, but too many others haven't. And we need to demand better from those we trust to protect us, and we need accountability and consequences and real change." And the reporters asked questions and Richard answered them calmly and clearly. And the story spread further, and other victims. Families reached out and Richard met with them, heard their stories, and each one added fuel to his determination. And Jake started physical therapy. And the work was hard and painful. But he pushed through it, and his therapist, Angela Porter, said he was making remarkable progress, and Jake said, "I have too much to do to stay broken." And Richard understood that his son had found purpose in his pain, had decided to turn tragedy into something meaningful, and Jake started working with Maria Santos, learning about community organizing, about policy change, about how to fight systems that seemed unchangeable. And together they planned campaigns and wrote letters and organized meetings, and slowly momentum built. And the police chief, Norman Hughes, resigned under pressure, and the city council appointed Deputy Chief Rachel Morgan as interim chief, and she immediately announced reforms, including mandatory de-escalation training and stricter use of force policies and independent oversight committees. And it wasn't enough, but it was a start, and Richard met with her and she said, "Commander Harrison, I can't undo what happened to your son, but I can try to make sure it doesn't happen again." And Richard said, "That's all I'm asking." And the trial date was set for 3 months away, and the waiting was difficult but necessary, and Richard used the time to build support, to amplify voices, to push for change beyond just this one case. The weeks before the trial moved like a river current, steady and relentless, and Richard split his time between supporting Jake and working with advocates for police reform, and his SEAL team stayed in contact, and several members visited, including Lieutenant Scott Barnes and Sergeant Kevin Walsh, who brought gifts and encouragement, and reminded Jake that he came from warrior stock and had the strength to get through this. And Jake appreciated their visit, though he still felt strange being called brave when all he had done was survive. And Richard told him that survival was its own form of courage, and Jake was learning to live with the scars, both visible and invisible. And he flinched at loud noises and had nightmares about breaking glass and gunfire, but he refused to let fear control him, and he returned to his classes at the community college. Though he couldn't manage a full load yet, and his professors were understanding, and his fellow students treated him with a mix of respect and pity that made him uncomfortable, and Professor Ellen Baker pulled him aside one day and said, "You don't have to be a symbol, Jake. You just have to be yourself." And that gave him some comfort, and the media attention was overwhelming, and reporters wanted interviews and TV shows wanted him to appear and tell his story, and Richard helped him navigate it all, taught him how to control the narrative, how to use the platform wisely. And Jake gave a few carefully chosen interviews and spoke about his experience and about the need for change, and his words were measured and thoughtful, and people listened, and the prosecution team, led by District Attorney Patricia Allen and her Assistant Deputy DA Marcus Webb, met with Richard and Jake regularly to prepare for trial, and they explained the strategy and the challenges and the fact that convicting police officers was notoriously difficult, regardless of evidence, and juries tended to give officers the benefit of the doubt, tended to believe their claims of fear and danger, and Patricia said, "We have the strongest case I've ever seen against officers, but we can't be overconfident, and we need to be prepared for anything." And Richard understood, and he had been in enough operations to know that even perfect plans could go wrong. And 3 weeks before trial, Officer Martinez requested a meeting through his lawyer, and Richard was surprised and suspicious, but agreed. And they met in a conference room at the courthouse, and Martinez looked haggard and broken, and he said, "Commander Harrison, I need you to know that I think about your son every single day, and I see his face when I close my eyes, and I know sorry isn't enough, and I know I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I take full responsibility and I'm pleading guilty to all charges." And Richard was stunned and asked why, and Martinez said, "Because it's the right thing to do, and because your son deserves justice, and because I can't live with myself if I don't own what I did." And his lawyer looked uncomfortable but didn't object. And Richard said, "What about Brooks?" And Martinez said, "He's fighting it, and he thinks we can win. But I know better, and I know what we did was wrong, and I'm going to say so in court." And Richard studied the man for a long moment and saw genuine remorse, genuine guilt, and said, I appreciate you taking responsibility and I hope you find some peace with it. But know that peace won't come easy." And Martinez nodded and said, "I don't deserve peace, but maybe someday I can earn forgiveness." And after he left, Richard sat alone in the conference room processing what had happened, and Patricia Allen came in and said, "This changes things." And with Martinez pleading guilty and agreeing to testify against Brooks, our case just got even stronger. And the news of Martinez's guilty plea made headlines, and public opinion shifted even further. And the police union distanced itself from him and issued statements supporting Brooks instead, and calling Martinez a traitor. And the division was clear, and the trial date arrived, and the courthouse was surrounded by protesters and supporters and media trucks, and security was tight. And Richard and Jake walked through the crowd together, and cameras flashed and people shouted encouragement, and Jake held his head high despite the fear churning in his stomach. And inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense, and Judge Margaret Foster called the court to order, and jury selection began, and it took 3 days to seat a jury of 12 people who could be impartial and who hadn't already made up their minds. And Richard watched each potential juror, carefully noting body language and reactions. And the final jury was mixed in age and background and included a former teacher, a nurse, a retired veteran, and several others. And opening statements began, and Patricia Allen stood before the jury and laid out the case. And she described that night in the store, and played the security footage, and you could hear gasps from the jury as they watched Jake fall. And she said this young man was guilty of nothing but being in the wrong place when 2 poorly trained officers made the worst decision of their lives, and they shot first and never asked questions, and now we're here seeking justice and accountability. And the defense attorney, Mr. Ronald Pierce, gave his opening, and he talked about the difficult job police officers have and the split-second decisions they face and the danger they encounter. And he said, Officer Brooks believed he was responding to a robbery, believed there was a weapon, believed his life was in danger, and he reacted as he was trained, and yes, it was a tragedy, but it wasn't a crime. And Richard listened and felt anger rising but kept his face neutral, and the first witnesses were called, and Mrs. Campbell testified again and described the shooting in detail. And the defense tried to shake her testimony, but she was steadfast and clear. And then the paramedic Amy, who had saved Jake's life, testified about his injuries, about how close he came to death, and Dr. Mitchell testified about the surgeries and the long recovery, and each testimony built the case. The prosecution called Officer Danny Martinez to the stand, and the courtroom fell silent as he was sworn in, and Patricia Allen began her questioning, and Martinez looked at the jury and said, I shot Jake Harrison without warning, without cause, and without justification. And I have to live with that for the rest of my life. And he described that night in detail, described how he and Brooks were distracted and unprepared, and how they saw Jake with his phone and assumed it was a weapon, and how they opened fire without taking a moment to assess the situation. And he said, we violated every protocol we were supposed to follow, and we failed in our duty to protect, and I take full responsibility for my actions. And the defense attorney, Ronald Pierce, tried to discredit Martinez during cross-examination and suggested he was only testifying to get a lighter sentence. But Martinez held firm and said no amount of cooperation will bring back the time Jake lost or heal his trauma, and I'm here because it's the truth. And the jury seemed moved by his testimony, and Richard watched and felt a complex mix of emotions, and he didn't forgive Martinez, but he respected his willingness to face what he had done. And then Officer Kyle Brooks took the stand in his own defense, and he told a different story. And he said they received a call about a possible robbery, and arrived on scene and saw someone inside moving suspiciously. And when they entered, he saw what looked like a weapon, and feared for his life and his partner's life, and had to make a split-second decision, and Patricia cross-examined him. And she played the dash cam footage, showing the officers talking about football and not paying attention, and she played the body camera footage showing no verbal commands, no attempt at de-escalation, and she asked if he had taken even 1 second to identify himself as police, and Brooks said there wasn't time, and she asked if he had taken even 1 second to assess whether Jake was actually armed, and Brooks said the lighting was poor, and she asked if he had any proof that Jake posed a threat, and Brooks said, I felt threatened, and she said, feelings aren't facts. Officer Brooks and a young man nearly died because of your feelings, and Brooks had no answer. And the prosecution rested, and the defense called use of force experts and police trainers. who testified about the dangers officers face and the need to make quick decisions, and they tried to paint Brooks as a dedicated officer who made a mistake under pressure, but the evidence was overwhelming. And during closing arguments, Patricia stood before the jury and said, "We ask a lot of our police officers, and we should, and they have a difficult job, and we respect that, but with authority comes responsibility, and with a badge comes accountability. And Officer Brooks failed in his responsibility, and failed in his duty. And Jake Harrison paid the price." And she pointed to Jake sitting in the courtroom and said, "Look at him and see the consequences of poor training and lack of discipline and reckless use of force. And this young man who wanted nothing more than to teach children and make his community better was shot 3 times while buying milk and bread. And Officer Brooks had every opportunity to prevent this tragedy and chose not to. And now you must hold him accountable. Because if we don't hold officers accountable when they fail this badly, then the badge means nothing." And the defense gave their closing, and Pierce argued that hindsight is 20/20, and in the moment Brooks believed he was facing danger and made the choice he thought would keep him and his partner alive, and it was tragic, but not criminal. And the jury deliberated for 2 days, and the waiting was agony. And Richard and Jake stayed at a hotel near the courthouse, and neither slept much, and they talked about everything and nothing, and Richard told stories about Jake's mother, about how she would have been so proud of the man he had become, and Jake said, "I wish she was here," and Richard said, "She is, and she always will be." And on the 3rd day the jury sent word they had reached a verdict, and everyone rushed back to the courthouse, and the courtroom filled quickly, and Judge Foster called for order, and the jury foreman, a middle-aged man named Tim Cooper, stood and read the verdict, and guilty on attempted manslaughter, and guilty on reckless endangerment, and guilty on multiple other counts, and Jake closed his eyes, and Richard squeezed his hand, and around them people cried and hugged, and in the back of the courtroom, Maria Santos wept openly, and Officer Brooks sat stone-faced as the verdict was read, and his lawyer immediately filed notice of appeal, but everyone knew it was over, and outside the courthouse Richard gave a statement, and he said, "Justice has been served today, but our work isn't finished, and we need to ensure this never happens to anyone else, and we need real reform and real accountability and real change." And reporters asked about Brooks and about Martinez, and Richard said Martinez did the right thing in the end by telling the truth, and I respect that, even though I can't forgive what he did, and Brooks chose to fight and lost, and now he'll face the consequences, and sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. And during that time, Richard and Jake met with other families affected by police violence, and they shared strategies and resources, and built a network of support, and Jake decided to change his major to criminal justice and focus on police reform. And Richard supported the decision, knowing his son had found his calling, and the sentencing hearing was packed, and victims of other police shootings attended, and family members gave impact statements, and Jake took the stand and looked at Officer Brooks and said, "You took something from me that I can never get back, and you took my sense of safety and my trust in those who are supposed to protect us, and I have nightmares, and I flinch at loud noises, and I wonder every day if I'll ever feel normal again. But I'm also grateful because I survived, and I have a chance to make sure this doesn't happen to others." Judge Margaret Foster listened to all the impact statements and then addressed the court, and she said police officers hold positions of tremendous trust and responsibility, and when that trust is violated, when that responsibility is abandoned, the consequences must be severe. And she sentenced Officer Kyle Brooks to 12 years in prison with possibility of parole after 8, and she sentenced Officer Danny Martinez to 6 years with possibility of parole after 4 due to his cooperation and guilty plea, and both men were remanded into custody immediately, and Brooks showed no emotion as he was led away. But Martinez looked back at Jake and Richard one last time, and there was something like peace in his eyes. And outside the courthouse, the celebration was tempered by the knowledge that 2 convictions wouldn't fix a broken system, and Maria Santos organized a rally, and hundreds attended, and speakers talked about the need for continued reform. And Richard spoke again, and he said, "Today we won a battle, but the war continues, and we need to push for change at every level, and we need to demand better training, better accountability, and better leadership." And the crowd cheered and chanted, and the energy was electric, and in the weeks that followed, the Riverside Police Department underwent massive restructuring, and new Chief Rachel Morgan implemented the promised reforms, and mandatory de-escalation training began. and use of force policies were rewritten, and an independent civilian oversight board was established to review all officer-involved shootings, and it wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And Richard was asked to testify before Congress about police reform. And he flew to Washington with Jake by his side, and they sat before a committee of senators and representatives, and Richard spoke about his experience about his son's shooting, about the need for national standards and federal oversight, and he compared military rules of engagement to police protocols, and highlighted the gaps, and several senators seemed moved and promised action. Though Richard knew political promises often meant little, and Jake also testified and spoke as a survivor about the trauma of being shot by those meant to protect, and about the importance of community policing and trust, and his testimony was powerful, and went viral on social media, and suddenly Jake Harrison became a name associated with police reform, and he received speaking invitations from universities and advocacy groups, and he accepted some and declined others, trying to balance his activism with his recovery and his education, and Richard returned to active duty, but took a position stateside so he could be near his son, and his SEAL team understood and supported the decision. And Captain Meyer said, "Family comes first always, and your son needs you and you need him." And Richard appreciated the understanding, and he threw himself into his new role while staying involved in the reform movement. And he wrote op-eds for major newspapers and gave interviews and used his platform to amplify the voices of those who had been fighting this fight long before him. And Maria Santos became a close friend and ally. And together, they founded an organization called Justice and Accountability that provided legal support and advocacy for victims of police violence, and the organization grew quickly and attracted donations and volunteers and began having real impact. And 6 months after the trial, Jake was physically recovered, though the psychological scars remained, and he attended therapy weekly and worked through his trauma, and his therapist, Dr. Susan Coleman, said he was making remarkable progress and learning to live with what had happened, rather than letting it define him. And Jake started dating again, and met a woman named Beth Anderson in one of his classes, and she was studying social work, and shared his passion for helping others, and they bonded over their desire to make the world better. And Richard met her and approved, and saw how happy she made his son. And Jake graduated from community college with honors, and transferred to a 4-year university to pursue his bachelor's degree in criminal justice. And he maintained a full course load while working part-time with Justice and Accountability, and speaking at events and writing articles about reform, and he was busy and fulfilled and purposeful. And Richard watched his son thrive and felt immense pride. And 1 year after the shooting, the community held a memorial vigil at the convenience store, and the new owners had installed a plaque in Jake's honor that read, "In memory of what was lost and in hope for what can be changed," and hundreds attended the vigil, including Mrs. Campbell, who hugged Jake and cried and said, "I'm so glad you survived," and Jake hugged her back and said, "Me too." And Richard stood with his arm around his son's shoulders and looked at the crowd and felt hope for the first time in a long time. And the national conversation about police reform continued, and several states passed new laws inspired by Jake's case, and body cameras became mandatory in more jurisdictions, and use of force standards were tightened, and civilian oversight boards were established, and it wasn't enough, and there were still shootings, still injustices, still a long way to go. But progress was being made, and Richard and Jake continued their work and their advocacy, and they became a team, father and son united by tragedy but defined by their response to it. And Officer Martinez served his time quietly and participated in every program offered, and took responsibility for his actions, and he wrote letters to Jake, though Jake never responded. And Richard understood that forgiveness wasn't required, wasn't owed, and healing looked different for everyone, and Officer Brooks appealed his conviction and lost, and began serving his sentence and showed no remorse and blamed everyone but himself, and his case became a cautionary tale about pride and denial. 2 years after the shooting, Jake Harrison stood before a graduating class at Riverside University and delivered the commencement speech, and he talked about resilience and purpose and the responsibility each person has to make their corner of the world better. And he told his story not as a victim, but as someone who had faced darkness and chosen to carry light forward, and the graduates and their families gave him a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. And Richard sat in the audience, in his dress uniform with tears streaming down his face because his son had not just survived, but had thrived. had taken something terrible and transformed it into something meaningful. And after the ceremony, they went to lunch at a small diner, and Jake brought his girlfriend Beth, who had become a constant presence in his life, and they talked about their plans. And Beth had been offered a job at a nonprofit that worked with at-risk youth, and Jake was starting graduate school in the fall to pursue a master's degree in public policy, and Richard said, "I'm proud of you both, and I'm proud of the work you're doing." And Jake said, "Dad, none of this would have been possible without you, and without what you taught me about standing up and fighting back." And Richard shook his head and said, "No. Son, you taught me and you showed me that courage isn't just about facing enemy fire, and it's about facing systemic injustice and corruption and fear. And you've been braver than any soldier I've known." And Jake smiled and squeezed Beth's hand and said, "We're all just doing what needs to be done." And the Justice and Accountability Organization had grown beyond anyone's expectations, and now had offices in 12 states, and a full-time staff of 30, and Maria Santos ran it with passion and efficiency, and they had helped dozens of families navigate the legal system after police shootings, and had pushed for policy changes that were being adopted across the country. And Richard remained on the board and contributed both time and money, and used his military connections to build bridges between law enforcement and reform advocates. And some police departments embraced the changes, and others resisted, but slowly attitudes were shifting, and the conversation was changing. And Chief Rachel Morgan in Riverside had become a national figure, speaking about reform from within, and proving that police leadership could champion accountability without undermining officer safety. And she had implemented programs that other departments were copying, and Riverside's rates of use of force incidents had dropped dramatically, and community trust had improved. And she often said that Jake's case had been a wake-up call that her department needed, and that the tragedy had forced necessary change. And Richard met with her regularly, and they had developed a mutual respect. And she said, "Commander, I can never undo what happened to your son, but I can ensure this department learns from it." And Richard said, "That's all any of us can do, and learn and change and be better." And on the second anniversary of the shooting, Jake published a book about his experience and about police reform, and about the journey from victim to advocate. And the book became a bestseller and started important conversations. And Jake did a book tour, speaking at universities and community centers and police academies. And yes, police academies, because some departments invited him to speak to recruits about the consequences of poor decisions and the importance of proper training and seeing things from a victim's perspective. And Jake accepted these invitations because he believed in dialogue and education and the possibility of change. And Richard accompanied him to several events and watched his son command rooms full of people with grace and wisdom and strength. And one evening, after a particularly difficult speaking engagement, where Jake had shared the most painful details of his shooting and recovery, they sat together in a hotel room, and Jake said, "Dad, do you think what we're doing makes a difference?" And Richard looked at his son and said, "I know it does. And every policy that changes, and every officer who thinks twice before pulling a trigger, and every family that gets justice because of the work you and Maria and others are doing. And that's the difference, and it's real, and it matters." And Jake nodded and said, "Sometimes it feels like we're fighting an ocean with a bucket." And Richard said, "Maybe, but enough people with enough buckets can change the tide, and you're not alone in this fight." And Jake smiled and said, "I know." And 3 years after the shooting, Officer Martinez was released on parole, and he had served his time and participated in restorative justice programs and written extensively about his mistakes and his regret. And upon release, he dedicated his life to speaking about police accountability and the need for better training. And he never tried to contact Jake directly, but his work in the reform space intersected with Justice and Accountability's mission. And Richard saw him at a conference, and they spoke briefly. And Martinez said, "I know I can never make this right, but I'm trying to prevent it from happening to others." And Richard said, "That's what matters now and what you do going forward." And Martinez nodded and walked away. And Richard felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps acceptance and the understanding that people were complex and capable of both terrible harm and genuine growth. And Jake completed his master's degree and was offered a position with a national police reform think tank. And he accepted and moved to Washington, D.C., and Beth went with him, and they got engaged and planned a small wedding, and Richard was overjoyed and gave his blessing and helped with planning. And the wedding took place in a small garden, and Maria Santos attended, and Mrs. Campbell attended and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by Jake's story. And Richard walked his son down the aisle and placed his hand in Beth's and said, "Take care of each other." And they said, "We will." And it was a day of joy and celebration. And Hope and Richard gave a toast and said, "My son has taught me that strength isn't just about physical courage, and it's about emotional resilience and moral clarity and the willingness to stand up when standing up costs everything. And Jake, you've shown all of that and more. And I'm honored to be your father." And the guests raised their glasses and cheered, and later that night Richard and Jake stood outside under the stars, and Jake said, "Thank you for everything, Dad, and for being there and for fighting with me." And Richard said, "I'll always fight with you and for you, and that's what family does." And Jake said, "I love you," and Richard said, "I love you too, son." And they stood in comfortable silence watching the stars and thinking about how far they had come and how much further there was to go, but knowing they would face it together.